intersection of sports and racial politics covered in prestige outlets like The Atlantic, The New Yorker, or Vice Media. News about the National Basketball Association's relationship with China made the front pages of both the New York Times and the Washington Post just in the last 2 weeks. To call the Renaissance a rebirth is to gesture towards its first birth, a moment that depends on how you choose to write your history. One could argue that the activist athlete was born in 1936, when Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals right before Hitler's eyes. Or in 1947, when Jackie Robinson first took the field for the Brooklyn Dodgers. Or maybe even 1949, when Jackie Robinson testified to his commitment to civil rights before the House Un-American Activities Committee. I bet not a lot of you knew that he did that, but he did, and I'd love to tell that story if you want to talk to me about it sometime. Wherever we place the origin of the activist athlete, the golden age of athletic activism is most often identified in John Carlos and Tommie Smith, the 2 American sprinters whose black-gloved fists at the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City were a beacon to poor people of color around the rapidly decolonizing world. And of course, Carlos and Smith were preceded by 1 year by Muhammad Ali, whose refusal to be drafted into the U.S. Army came with the strident announcement that he had no quarrel with the Viet Cong. By 1970, when Curt Flood sued Major League Baseball for the right to become a free agent, the golden age of athletic activism was already in its twilight. And I want to consider at least one explanation for the activist athlete's decline over the next 40 years. But before I do, I want to turn to the Renaissance, because as easy as it is to cling to memories of Carlos and Smith and Ali, as if the racial problems of the nation hadn't changed much since 1968, the political context that surrounds contemporary black athletes is now very different. Exactly when the resurgence of athletic activism began is not entirely clear. But according to Washington Post sports writer Cindy Boren, the Trayvon Martin killing in Florida in 2012 is a good place to start. That moment, she said, offered athletes the chance to use their platform. When the Miami Heat, for whom LeBron James then played, stepped up with James, Dwayne Wade, Chris Bosh, and others posing for a photo wearing hoodies. 6 years later, at his Pro Football Hall of Fame induction ceremony, Randy Moss wore a necktie bearing the names of black people killed by police. Asked about his tie on ESPN, Moss expressed his desire to, quote, use a big platform like this at the Hall of Fame. Between the Heat and hoodies and Moss's tie lie enough examples of outspoken black athletes to identify a surge in the number of black athletes identifiable as social and political activists, a media narrative devoted to telling its story, and the narrative's reliance on courageous speech as the reason to place faith in a new generation of activists. As Boren writes, quote, when it comes to political and social activism, athletes of all colors and genders are finding their voice and refusing to remain silent, whether in vocal, physical, or social media demonstrations. The photograph of the Heat-wearing hoodies was hardly the most consequential effect of Trayvon Martin's death. The following year, when George Zimmerman was acquitted of his murder, 3 black women, Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrisse Cullors, inserted Black Lives Matter into the cultural vocabulary, a hashtag that began to circulate widely only after police in Ferguson, Missouri killed Michael Brown the following year. The renaissance of athletic activism's simultaneous emergence with what is now called the Movement for Black Lives suggests overlapping agendas and strategies. In fall 2014, several National Basketball Association stars, including LeBron James, Kyrie Irving, and Derrick Rose, wore t-shirts bearing the inscription, I can't breathe, in order to protest the police killing of Eric Garner in New York. At the end of that year, Vice Sports would call 2014 the year of the activist athlete, but the summit hadn't even yet been reached. In July 2016, after being fined by the WNBA for wearing black warm-up jerseys to express concern about police violence, the entire squads of the New York Liberty and Indiana Fever refused to take post-game questions from the press about their basketball game. Liberty shooting guard Tanisha Wright explained that their determination to discuss anything that's happening in society reflected a desire to, quote, use our platforms. We want to be able to use our voices, Wright said. We don't want to let anybody silence us. And then in August, Colin Kaepernick took a knee. He explained that his refusal to salute the US flag during the ceremonial pregame recital of the national anthem was motivated by bodies in the street and people getting paid leave and getting away with murder. As Black Lives Matter acquired the shape of a social movement within prevailing media frames, so too went the story for black athletes, who used their platforms to exercise their voices, raise awareness, provoke discussion, and advance a national conversation about race. As athletic activism calls attention to racist police violence, it participates with new social movements in marking a shift in the texture and visibility of black political speech in the United States. To be fair, the media are not completely unanimous in their celebration of activist athletes. Among a narrow group of sports journalists like Clay Travis, whose recent book, Republicans Buy Sneakers Too, lies the case that sports should be a uniting, not a dividing force, though small and generally confined to what today passes for conservative media. Travis's claim reveals a backlash to the revival of athletic activism, one similarly born again rather than born anew. When we decide to politicize sports, says Travis, what we are doing is bringing the noxiousness and divisiveness of politics into an arena that doesn't need it. Along with Laura Ingram's now infamous assertion that athletes like LeBron James should shut up and dribble, this is a view that both overlooks the fundamental fact that athletes are also citizens entitled to speak like any other, and falsely pretends that existing rituals surrounding sports are politically neutral. Symbols of the nation, the flag, the anthem, military flyovers, saturate sporting events and their telecasts, which brings their contradictory meanings with them. What Travis and others lament is not that sports has become political, but that the renaissance of the activist athlete is challenging a political consensus that was never as unanimous as they once supposed. When nationalist symbols are treated as natural artifacts beyond the critical watch of a democratic society, sports starts to flirt with fascism. Travis and those like him wish for a consensus that does not exist, and the desire to impose it reflects a panicky impulse to protect the social order from the dangers of dissent. Surely then, if the likes of Travis and Ingram see the spectacular speaking performances of black athletes as such a danger, athletes must be saying something we ought to pay attention to. This is where I want to turn to the rhetorical tradition to help us understand the democracy in which we live, and within which the renaissance of the activist athlete is situated. The speechwriters of ancient Greece were men, and they were men, called sophists. They had a bit of a shady reputation, not unlike the image we have today of sleazy lawyers. God, I hope there aren't any lawyers in the room. I The obligations placed on citizens were robust in the ancient world. They had to speak in the assembly, speak in the courts, and speak on ceremonial occasions like weddings and funerals. And the sophists, they'd write anything for a few bucks. Well, a few drachmas, if you want to get technical about it. Owing in no small part to the opinions of Plato, rhetoric, understood as the study of persuasion, got a pretty bad name. About 100 years later, Aristotle would revive rhetoric by turning it into a systematic art, one that he thought protected citizens from corruption and violence. As Ronald W. Green, a rhetorical scholar at my alma mater, the University of Minnesota, once put it, one heroic history of rhetoric begins with the disavowal of the economic motivations of speechwriters and a call for a political rhetoric, one harnessed to the needs of communal governance and republican, with a small r, virtues. Here's why this brief digression into the ancient world matters. The idea that citizen speech ought to be separated from economic motivations is actually the primary explanation for the decline of athletic activism from the 1970s till 2012. In that era, the economic modernization of sport caused professional athlete salaries to soar. In 2005, filmmaker Spike Lee blamed the disappearance of activist athletes on a kind of willful amnesia, on athletes who, quote, know nothing of the many African-American athletes who put their careers on the line to fight for future generations. Unfortunately, said Spike, the only thing that matters to today's players is getting paid. In 2007, Newsday's Sean Powell wrote that, quote, highly paid athletes are too busy hiding behind their precious public profiles and endorsement deals to lend a voice to activism, which means they've sold out in their worship of the almighty dollar. Around the same time, New York Times sports writer William C. Roden published a social history of sport called $40 Million Slaves, a book which has stood as an authoritative commentary on the decline of athletic activism since its publication. Roden argued that black athletes had traded their social obligations for wealth and fame. Roden had, what I think, is the astonishing gall to say that, quote, contemporary black athletes have abdicated their responsibility to their communities with treasonous vigor. As the renaissance of the activist athlete unfolds a decade later, it's no surprise then that black athletes are being narrated by our media as rhetorical citizens. As Vice Sports' Samuel Friedman said in 2015, they have helped to move history forward and expanded a national conversation about racial inequality that needs to keep going. A conversation is afoot, and as this wisdom goes, we ought to listen to activist athletes, for they repudiate the treacherous impulses of their recent forebears and reclaim a legacy of courageous, righteous speech. This is the point at which I want to challenge conventional wisdom. I have two worries. First, I wonder if anti-racist political speech today retains the same capacity to induce changes in social attitudes and policy outcomes as was often supposed. Many of us know that the images of violence and oppression in places like Birmingham, Alabama in the early 1960s shocked the conscience of the nation and accelerated the pace of the civil rights movement. The central idea that drove Martin Luther King's approach to nonviolent resistance was moral persuasion. But does moral persuasion work anymore? Can moral persuasion work in an era in which the suffering of black and brown people causes a dismissive groan? An era in which racist cruelty seems to be the point? Among the many social, scientific, and anecdotal accounts of escalating political polarization after 2016 is Michael Tesler's discovery that Donald Trump's explicit appeals to white racial grievance, quote, means that racial attitudes are now more closely aligned with white Americans' partisan preferences than they have been at any time in the history of polling. The facts of political polarization around race are troubling for Democratic rhetoric. Many fine people, Donald Trump tells us, are on both sides. Under such conditions, moral persuasion aims at an absent target, which, if it ever existed, doesn't seem to exist anymore. If public discourse about race exacerbates racial divisions, one wonders what can become of raised fists, slogan-bearing t-shirts, and kneeling before National Football League games. As criticisms of the NFL mounted, according to Vox's PR Lockhart, it became common to see supporters and opponents of the kneeling players alike arguing that the protesters had chosen a method that was too polarizing. Trump's response to Colin Kaepernick marks a pattern of racial antipathy and crystallizes the culture war logic through which white nationalism gathers its strength. Kaepernick became an instrument with which to sow social and political division along racial lines. Polarization not only thwarts the activist athlete's potential, but is also perhaps even amplified by the political activism of black athletes. So my first concern has to do with political polarization, the reflexive retreat into comforting ideologies that happens whenever we talk about race. It's possible, however, that polarization is not something to fear, but something to embrace. Contrary to popular belief, writes Bomani Jones, stands do not create divisions and fissures, they amplify them. The whole point of a stand is to put them on display, to ask the world to confront and examine their hypocrisies, and ask why they're on one side and not the other. On this view, activist athletes speak not to an undecided middle, but to their adherents in an effort to draw out their distinctiveness and sharpen the political landscape. But here's my second concern. Just because rhetoric is grounded in a heroic mythology hostile to the influence of money, does not mean that money and politics have ever been disentangled. Nor does the apparent rediscovery of moral courage among athletes mean that sports political messaging escapes money's influence. New York Times columnist David Leonhardt called NFL protesters who followed Kaepernick's example, quote, heirs to the civil rights movement for, quote, showing courage frequently lacking among the affluent and the famous. The civil rights frame helps to make sense of the renaissance of the activist athlete in a manner that fuses citizenship to a disavowal of political speech's economic motivations. Such a disavowal, however, can be misleading and comes with a price. Even if we want to see the polarization of political culture as a benefit to democracy, in the form of clarified antagonisms, capitalism helps to determine not only which divisions are allowed to emerge in the first place, but which must remain invisible to prevent anti-racism from disrupting the marketplace or putting corporate power at risk. Green suggests that, quote, the idea of the rhetorical citizen must be tempered by the political economy of political rhetoric. So we know that political forces help to determine economic outcomes. Who's in charge of our government helps to determine, in many cases, who's rich and who's poor. Political economy refers to this, but also refers to its reverse, to the idea that economic forces help to determine political outcomes. To think about the political economy of political rhetoric, then, is to think about the way that economic forces shape both who has the capacity to speak and what can be said. Using the term money speech to describe the relationship between money and speech after the Supreme Court Citizens United decision, Green suggests that money speech moves the citizen out of the public sphere and into an apparatus of advocacy populated by electioneering communication, PACs, and 527s. Citizens United had the effect of attaching First Amendment protections to corporations and expanding the notion of corporate personhood, primarily by calling money a form of expression. That is to say, money doesn't simply support or pay for political expression. The expense is itself the expression. A formula that has grave consequences for ordinary citizens who cannot make million-dollar contributions to political action committees and 527s. With respect to the history of the activist athlete, consider the difference between Muhammad Ali, who became a citizen of the world through the power of his charisma and public address, and contemporary black athletes, who compete for attention and influence with corporate public relations departments, communications consultants, and poll-tested messaging. Just before announcing its rule prohibiting athletes who take the field for the national anthem from demonstrating disrespectfully, we still don't know what that means, the NFL hired the Glover Park Group, located on F Street here in Washington, D.C. Anybody work for the Glover Park Group? The NFL hired the Glover Park Group to gather data on fan attitudes about Colin Kaepernick. According to Yahoo Sports, the NFL approved research that sought two pieces of information. One, whether Americans believe Kaepernick should be signed by an NFL team. And two, whether they believe Kaepernick remained unemployed because he refused to stand for the anthem or due to his on-field performance. Now, the NFL eventually rescinded its rule, but not without first revealing the relationship between money and speech. The league would say only what it could sell, a calculation we see repeated with the NBA in China. In the context of money speech, black athletes inclined to political expression have three apparent options. First, they can practice a form of citizenship called philanthrocapitalism, a branding strategy that relies on charitable foundations to build goodwill and demonstrate corporate social responsibility. Many professional athletes, like LeBron James, run high-profile charities. Second, they can use social media to communicate with their fans, allow advertisers to shape their image, and establish a brand out of the image of rebelliousness. One example of this choice occurred when defensive back Richard Sherman, then playing for the Seattle Seahawks, told us that the term thug is an accepted way of calling somebody the N-word now. Now, that's true, but it established an edginess easily converted into Campbell's soup commercials. As Zito Manu put it in SB Nation, in order to speak about injustice, you need a platform, and brands have the means to provide it. Third, athletes can try to fight money speech, like Colin Kaepernick, and hope to refocus our collective attention on racism. The price of this choice, though, tends to be censure, professional banishment, and careers cut short in their prime while grossly inferior talent continues to get work. Endorsing athletic activism, investing in it, or embracing its return, I contend, requires understanding the way that our public life has been overrun by corporate communication strategies and public relations professionals. Prevailing strategies of anti-racism have become the instruments through which corporations burnish their democratic credentials, and the marketplace presents the promise of universal liberty. Investing revolutionary hope in activist athletes for their courageous willingness to speak can be a mistake, not because their anti-racist arguments are false or unpersuasive, but because it risks an overinvestment in speech as a political instrument. Tethering hope to their platform commits us to the processes by which the platform is built, which does not simply enrich corporate media institutions and the advertisers on which they depend, but also endorses a conception of citizenship that capitalism has figured out how to steal. Citing television commercials from Pepsi and Nike that deploy the imagery of black activist athletes, journalist Howard Bryant wonders, quote, "If protest is now marketable, it ceases to be protest. If activism is cool, full of celebrity and corporate backing, it loses its purpose, its dissonance. If corporations are getting involved, co-opting, mainstreaming dissent, it isn't really dissent." Well, if those examples, punctuated by Kaepernick's relationship with Nike, epitomize the fate of activist-athlete anti-racism, one is left to wonder, what counts as real dissent? What kinds of anti-racist political action are beyond the reach of corporate power? The answer I propose consists in the kind of protest predicated on labor activism. The kind of protest that allows us to see black athletes as workers. My suspicion is that struggles for social justice no longer work through moral persuasion, but can be very effective through the application of leverage. Bryant's book, The Heritage, persists in describing black athletes as the most visible and powerful black employees in America. Except he grasps at little, besides the kind of courageous speech that forces athletes to incur dramatic risks to their personal wealth. Citing the historical examples of Jackie Robinson, Muhammad Ali, Tommy Smith, John Carlos, and baseball player Curt Flood, Bryant writes that, quote, "To join the Heritage, you had to pay the cost. These individuals all risked and all lost something." The trouble with distinguishing the heroes from the sellouts by trying to figure out who's risked the most is that that standard radically personalizes politics through the righteous rhetorical citizen. The brave speaker who can command attention inside the public square without regard for the advancing pitchforks. In addition to romanticizing personal devastation as civic virtue, armchair estimates of risk overlook the strategies by which risk can be shared and political action collectivized. In 2012, only months before the Miami Heat appeared in their hoodies, I published Curt Flood in the Media, Baseball, Race, and the Demise of the Activist Athlete, in which I argue that Curt Flood, the first baseball player to seriously threaten ownership's grip on the Curt Flood was the first baseball player to seriously threaten ownership's grip on the player's labor autonomy. He stood between contrary political strategies in 1970. Flood was a black man who, after refusing to be traded from the St. Louis Cardinals to the Philadelphia Phillies, filed a federal lawsuit claiming that the owners had violated the 13th Amendment's prohibition of involuntary servitude and were in breach of antitrust law. He appeared on national television with Howard Cosell to rebut the contention that his $90,000 salary somehow mitigated his exploitation by insisting to a doubting nation that, quote, "a well-paid slave is nonetheless a slave." It was an explosive claim. But within the shifting fabric of black political culture at the dawn of the 1970s, support for Flood was pretty universal. But it was split between, on the one hand, black radicals who heard slavery and saw that as an expression useful for dramatizing broader injustices in sport and society, and on the other hand, black liberals who saw slavery as a gambit, a bit of a strategy, just useful for pressuring the owners into moderation and reform. Baseball would adopt a version of free agency in 1975, a reform with which Flood is often credited as having instigated, and after which athletes enjoyed a 40-year period of explosive salary growth. Salary growth, I should add, proceeds apace. As the liberal story triumphed in the decades after Flood's lawsuit, he reemerged in the 2000s as an activist hero against whom a spoiled and selfish generation of black athletes would be measured as inadequate and craven. Flood now anchors a line of moral reasoning which holds that contemporary athletes owe him recognition, gratitude, and most of all, continued vigilance in struggle. The irony, of course, is that material wealth, the poison presumed to have killed athletic activism, is most frequently described as the reward for which contemporary athletes are supposed to be grateful. In light of contemporary events, marked by rich black athletes seemingly risking their wealth in the pursuit of social justice, I want us to confront the cognitive dissonance required to ignore the irony Curt Flood represents. In other words, perhaps what made Flood a hero is not the fact that he put his salary at risk, but that he threatened baseball owners with the baseball players' collective labor power. Speech, including the slavery metaphor, might have been necessary for Flood to communicate his seriousness and rally some supporters, but it was the fact that he was willing to withhold his labor. He left baseball in 1970, never played again. And the possibility that other baseball players might do the same thing, that is what convinced baseball owners to treat Flood as a moral threat to their profits. If memories of Flood's heroism shift away from individual persuasion and toward leverage, his economic motivation is not something to disavow, but something to foreground and embrace. Overemphasizing courageous speech also prevents us from fully understanding what makes the renaissance of the activist athlete a rebirth. For example, Colin Kaepernick's anti-racist demonstrations during the national anthem are frequently compared to the most iconic example of black protest in sport, the Mexico City protest. What happened in 1968, though, was the outcome of a year's worth of consciousness raising that began to take shape in California's Bay Area in 1967. Carlos and Smith had been active participants in the Olympic Project for Human Rights, an organization established by Harry Edwards, the young sociologist and ex-athlete who returned to San Jose State in the mid-1960s after doctoral work at Cornell. Edwards observed and had himself lived the mistreatment of black athletes on a white college campus. So he organized the San Jose State football team into striking until their formalized racial justice demands were met. The strike worked. The team refused to play the University of Texas El Paso, cost the school around $100,000, and rapidly forced the university administration to hire black faculty, admit more black students, and commit resources to fostering their academic success. In his 1969 book, Revolt of the Black Athlete, Edwards explained the strike's primary lesson from 1967. He said, "We have learned the use of power, the power to be gained from exploiting the white man's economic and almost religious involvement in athletics." Though pundits and historians lionize Carlos and Smith's raised fists, it was actually a collective labor action that both made the spectacle possible and ultimately had the most tangible effect. Seeing sport as a form of labor opens an angle of vision into the leverage black athletes today possess. In the fall of 2015, black students organized at the University of Missouri over several high-profile incidents of overt racism on campus. One such incident had been directed at Peyton Penn, the university's first black gay student body president. That precipitated the formation of a protest group called Concerned Student 1950, so named for the year Mizzou admitted its first black students. After a series of confrontational demonstrations on campus over several weeks, it was about 2.5 months actually, Jonathan Butler, a graduate student in journalism, connected campus racism with cuts to graduate student health care and the defunding of Planned Parenthood facilities. Butler proceeded to go on a hunger strike, intended to continue, as he put it, quote, "until either University President Tim Wolf is removed from office or my internal organs fail and my life is lost." Over the following week, the administration offered little but calls to temper unrest and invitations to additional dialogue. What the university wanted, of course, was more conversation. The university always wants more conversation. The football team became aware of Butler's encampment on the quad through a player named Jamon Moore. Within a few days, the team decided to strike on Butler's behalf. Players issued a collective public statement indicating their refusal to, quote, participate in any football-related activities until President Tim Wolf resigns or is removed due to his negligence toward marginalized students. Head's position as student body president could not be leveraged in any meaningful way. Concerned student 1950s demonstrations were ignored and dismissed. University administrators seemed content to let Jonathan Butler die. These events unfolded over the course of an entire semester, but within 36 hours after the football team announced its strike, Tim Wolf resigned from office. What those players or anyone who watched them learn from the strike is still a bit of an open question. But it certainly was an exercise in the use of power, a vivid demonstration of leverage applied to the white man's economic and almost religious involvement in athletics. As professional sports agent Don Yee told Howard Bryant, quote, "The players, I'm telling you, have no idea how much power they really have. If they wanted to, they could take the whole thing down." But Yee isn't talking about more speech, more conversation, or moral persuasion. He's talking about the kind of leverage only athletic labor possesses. Some black activist athletes like Colin Kaepernick speak a language which fits easily inside corporate marketing strategies. Over images of Colin Kaepernick walking coolly in street clothes through a dimly lit city in a Nike advertisement, he asks us to believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything. Well, not only does the imagery sink into the advertising currents alongside allergy medications and heavy-duty pickup trucks, but the message remains safe and inert, empty of any meaningful political content. One imagines that Donald Trump's strongest white nationalist adherents also believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything. Or it could be a slogan for the US Army. More troubling, however, is the fact that even if the advertisement is taken at face value as an anti-racist message, it is impossible, literally by definition, for Nike to send an anti-corporate message. Indeed, it does the opposite. It tells us that our anti-racist attitudes are affirmed and cultivated when we deepen our investment in corporations as democratic institutions. My worry stems not from the kind of dilution to which corporate messaging is susceptible in a vast and complex media ecology, but from the sense that the political economy of political rhetoric places anti-racist messaging at odds with meaningful forms of anti-capitalism. The size of the activist athlete's audience is in fact rendered enormous through corporate platforms, but the scope of what can be said on a platform is not. Perhaps if we could trust corporations to behave in ways contrary to their profit motives, deals like Nike's would not be so vexing, but we can't. Perhaps if capitalism were not complicit with racist histories and rationalities, we could count on it to do the anti-racist work for us. But it is. Other activist athletes, like those who organized at Missouri in 2015, saw, at least momentarily, that struggles fought under the sign of labor, alongside labor, in concert with labor, or in a coalition with labor, can have arresting political effects. Bomani Jones is right that protests which do not offend tend to not be worth the effort. What needs to be expanded, however, is less the range of speaking performances we recognize as legitimate, righteous, courageous, or persuasive, but the range of villains who appear on the stage of racial injustice, the targets athletes are willing and able to offend. Let's invite the possibility that black athletes might not only discover the use of power, as Harry Edwards once put it, but connect the Renaissance they embody to broader struggles against power and violence in the United States.